Welcome to 1984 Lore, the channel for all things 1984, and today we'll be analysing the 1956 film adaptation of the novel, and 5 things I didn't like about it. I suspect that most of you likely hold the Radford 1984 adaptation up as the gold standard of the screen adaptations, which I agree with. Just as I have commonly heard praise for Radford's version, I rarely hear the same for the 1956 film. One prominent detractor was the widow of Orwell herself, Sonia Orwell. She apparently felt the film was somewhat unfaithful to the book, and visually speaking, among other things, I think I'd have to agree. The first thing I particularly dislike, and which is probably the most superficial inconsistency, are the ministry buildings. In the book, they are clearly described as vast pyramidal structures, all 4 easily seen from the roof of Victory Mansions. Yet in the film, they're kind of hive-shaped for some reason. Of course, it could be argued that putting this to screen in 1956 may have been a little difficult, yet I personally don't think it would have been that difficult or even expensive. Indeed, just 2 years before, the BBC adaptation of the novel famously opens with a pan of the Ministry of Truth, showing that it was possible. You may be thinking that practically anything that isn't strictly consistent with the novel may get me criticising the film. However, I get that with the visual media, a true scene-by-scene exact representation is probably unrealistic given budget and time constraints. Even Radford's film had characters and scenes missing or things done slightly differently. For example, when Julia hands Winston written instructions on their first meeting rather than describe it, which is actually how she does it in the book. However, when such inconsistencies are easy to eliminate, I just find it a little disappointing and unnecessary. So with number 2 delving into characters, if I had to choose between Winston and Julia, I would have to give it to Winston in this case, or more specifically Edmund O'Brien's portrayal of Winston. No offence is meant for my American cousins, but I feel that one thing the Radford film has over its rivals in spades is excellent casting, and O'Brien, whom I'll call Edmund going forward for obvious reasons, just doesn't fit. For a Londoner in the future 1980s of Orwell's setting, Winston is, well, very American. That's not to say that an American actor couldn't play the role excellently, but Edmund doesn't sound the part. Perhaps a decent attempt at an appropriate accent, or perhaps the Queen's English may have been better. Again, it's impossible for me not to compare Edmund to John Hurt, who fit the part like a hand in a silk glove. Another obvious misfit for me is his appearance. I hate to say it, but, well, Edmund was a little too chubby for Winston. Perhaps he would have been better cast as Parsons. Again, this is not to impugn his acting abilities, but rather to point out an obvious inconsistency. A stark comparison can be made with Hurt again. Remember the Part 3 scenes? Hurt simply looked horrific, almost skeletal, whereas Edmund seemed as if he hadn't skipped a meal or snack throughout shooting. Visuals, then, are important. Even the best actor in the world will simply struggle in creating immersion for viewers if he simply doesn't look the part. Number 3, and close behind Winston today, is Julia, but for a couple of different reasons. Now this may seem strange, and this is quite subjective obviously, but I think many may agree with me that Jan Sterling is miscast, in that she's, well, too pretty for Julia, to be frank. To a less egregious extent, she doesn't look the part, with her blonde hair and beautiful looks. In the novel, at best, Winston considers Julia pretty, and of course there is an intense attraction there. Yet we do see clarification on this issue when Winston thinks to himself that, apart from her mouth, you could not call Julia beautiful. I again can't resist comparison with Radford's film. Like Hurt, Susanna Hamilton just feels perfectly cast and fits the visual of what Julia is. Certainly not ugly, but not exceptionally beautiful either. Another relevant sneaky dislike I'll roll in here too is the character's attitude. At one stage, she's talking about how she would like a child, and is portrayed as almost like a passive, wet flannel type of person, whereas true fans of the novel know that Julia is a rebel from the waist down and spirited type of person, not really in keeping with Sterling's housewife-like performance here. Number 4, so another jarring thing for me that I've never been able to get past, and something even more easily remedied than the ministry building's inconsistency, is the costume choices. I just don't get it. This is clear as day in the book. Party comrades wear overalls, outer party blue and inner party black. I appreciate that the film was black and white, so the colouring may be a little lost, though if the outer party members wore very light blue, I think the contrast would still be there and noticeable for viewers. In the film, we have the outer party characters wearing something like a suit jacket and trousers. The women too have an odd handmaid's tale headpiece thing going on. I could be wrong, but I believe that the whole point behind such attire in the book was that all party members were considered comrades regardless of sex. Again, the Radford adaptation hits the nail squarely on the head with this. Indeed, I think this is reasonable to say, as later in the novel, Orwell makes a point of Julia going to some lengths to feel more feminine by buying a dress as well as makeup and perfume. This says a lot about the party dress code and how this in itself is oppressive to both sexes, but particularly women perhaps. Like anything else that promotes individualism and a potential pathway to own life, uniforms help to homogenize party members, to give them a visual sense of collectivization as part of the whole. In the 1956 film, not only are there no overalls, but O'Brien seems to be a more militaristically attired figure. In the colorized version, we can see he does wear the appropriate black, but this particular costume again defeats the whole point of why Orwell chose to have party members in color differentiated overalls. Number 5. Finally, we get to what has to be the greatest sin of the film, and something Sonia Orwell took umbrage with, the ending. To be fair, it's truer to say the alternative ending, as 2 endings were filmed. The usual ending goes as expected, with Winston screaming "Long live Big Brother," although outside of the Chestnut Tree Cafe, in the context of having met with Julia and after hearing news of an oceanic victory. However, in another version, Winston's reaction to the news is to shout "Down with Big Brother" to the shock of many nearby, before he is shot by some police. To compound this, Julia too has a sudden change of heart and is also shot, presumably dying still loving Winston, as she reaches out for him with her final dying breath. That this was even shot, for me, betrays how the screenplay writers Ralph Gilbert Bettison and William Templeton either fundamentally misunderstood why Orwell wrote the ending the way he did, or that they simply didn't care. Either way, it's bad. Inconsistencies are one thing. As I've said, even Radford's film has them. However, this is in a different league, as the whole point of the novel was to show how bad things could get if a country like the UK ever fell to the worst kind of totalitarian government. That there is no hope is precisely part of the point. It strengthens this message and gets people thinking. Orwell never intended the book to be a fluffy fairy tale in the generic mould of good overcoming evil, or even hope remaining alive against all the odds. This, of course, is not even mentioning the fact that such defiance totally undermines the horror of both Winston and Julia's respective transformations. It's made crystal clear in the book that curing in Minilove and passage through Room 101 is a one-way and irreversible process. Quote, "Things will happen to you from which you could not recover if you lived 1,000 years." In a point of similarity with Sandra Newman's novel Julia, spoiler incoming, so skip ahead now if you don't want to hear it. She too seemingly brushes off Minilove's effects, as Julia remains very much herself, if somewhat damaged physically obviously, in that novel too. The fact that Winston could have such an outburst like this and also be shot out of hand rather than rearrested and fixed, as the Fort Police would likely term it, really is an unforgivable and massive break with the film's canon source material. Julia too, contrary to O'Brien's insistence that they would never again feel love or happiness, somehow dies loving Winston. So what do you think of my choices today? Of course, there are many other possible entries, and even more to talk about with number 5, but I'll leave it here for today. If you enjoyed the video, then please drop it a like and share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you, comrades, And remember, if there is hope, it lies in the proles.